post-positivist metaphysics, the metaphysical side of philosophy of mind has developed as well as the philosophical psychology side of philosophy of mind. So that Robert's interest is in the philosophical psychology side, or in the tradition of Gilbert Ryle, Wittgenstein. And O'Connor's approach is much more in the metaphysical side in relationship more to philosophy of science. David?
He's not assuming that mind and body are one. He's not assuming that
No, he's, you know, if you try to pin him down on what is your view of mind, he would come out, I think, as something of an epiphenomenalist. That is to say that what is the reality underlying this? Brain processes. And there are mental phenomena which are the side effect of brain processes. So I think that Ryle is some kind of epiphenomenalist. Now, sometimes called a behaviorist, but only if you have the preface linguistic behaviorism. You see, talk about mind is talk about private or public behaviors, as the case may be. Yeah. And his view would be that the language about mind is translatable without remainder into behavior language, language about behaviors. So it's this translatability thing again. Okay. Now that was Ryle. Do you want to pause and reflect there before I head on? He introduces one thing that's become quite famous in the concept of a machine. He labels Descartes' view of mind as somehow or other in the body, as the myth of a ghost in a machine. Now that phrase, the ghost in a machine, has become famous. And you hear it quoted in all sorts of things. It's almost as famous as cogito ergo sum, really. It's one of those phrases that you find journalists pick up on, and so on and so forth. The myth of a ghost in a machine. What he's doing there is simply, he's in the process of arguing that simply because words mind and body are both nouns doesn't mean there is one entity inside another entity. You see, the myth of a ghost in a machine. Okay, of the three people I'm discussing here, J.L. Austin, by all means, is the most fun. That's not a criterion of philosophical acumen, though it certainly helps the medicine down. Tremendous sense of humor, really. His book, How to Do Things with Words, published in 1955, tried to systematize different types of language usage. In other words, he thinks that in all this multitude of uses that Wittgenstein has introduced, there may be certain major types of utterance. And he tries to systematize those in a way that has been quite influential. He distinguishes, he distinguishes cognitive utterances in the sense of assertions and propositions from performative utterances of more varied sort. You remember I said that according to Ayer, the phrase "it is true that" is just a performative utterance. It doesn't add anything. It's rather doing something rather than asserting something. It's a performative utterance. All right, what he talks about are locutionary acts, illocutionary acts, and perlocutionary acts. Now, these are what we come to call nowadays language acts. That phrase, language acts, having been coined, I think it was coined, by John Searle, teaches at Berkeley, John Searle in his book Speech Acts. Speech Acts. And notice that in the notion of language acts, speech acts is the idea that the use of language is a kind of social behavior. All right, then, distinguish the locutionary from the illocutionary. A locutionary act is simply an act of saying something. Very general category. A locution, an utterance. But an illocutionary act is where you act in saying something, hence illocutionary. Perlocutionary, you act by means of saying something. Perlocutionary. Now, the example, an illocutionary act, the saying is itself the act. You're acting in saying it, announcing a verdict, answering a question, giving advice. In talking the way you're talking, you're giving advice. Perlocutionary, the language is just the means. You're persuading somebody to do something. You are stopping someone from doing something. You are annoying someone by what you are saying. The significance is not in what you are saying, but what you are trying to accomplish by means of saying it. You could have said something else and might have worked as well. Again, getting at the variety of things we use. Well, that sort of thing introduces the notion of language acts, language behaviors, makes it very popular. But the other thing about J.L. Austin that you will be interested in is his book Sense and Sensibilia. Now, notice the name is Austin. Are you familiar with another Austin? Jane Austen, whose book was Sense and Sensibility. That was a novel. This is J.L. Austin, Sense and Sensibilia. Not Jane, but John. Okay? Sense and Sensibilia. Just the title is a joke, and that's typical of Austin. I don't mean the whole book is a joke. I mean, I guess that makes it a perlocutionary act. He's telling a joke by means of language he's doing something else with. Okay. Now, this book is an attack on the sense-datum theory of A.J. Ayer. Not the A.J. Ayer of Language, Truth, and Logic, but the A.J. Ayer of his book, I think, The Foundations of Empirical Knowledge. Because Ayer developed the view, a phenomenalist view, that all we know is sense-touch. Now, Austin argues in Sense and Sensibilia that this is due to his obsession with a few words and an oversimplification of their uses. Words which denote sense data, like blue, square, etc. Or expressions like looks, appears, seems. which are all twisted and taken to mean that ordinary sense perception suffers from such illusion that we can never be sure whether we're seeing a material object or not. So we say it appears, it looks, it seems. Okay. To get something of the style of the man, here's the way he begins. My general opinion about this doctrine is that it's a typically scholastic view, attributed first to an obsession with a few particular words, and second to an obsession with a few half-studied facts. The fact is, as I'll try to make clear, our ordinary words are much subtler in their uses and make many more distinctions than philosophers have realized, and that the facts of perception, as discovered, for instance, by psychologists, but also as noted by common mortals, are much more diverse and complicated than has been allowed for. So I'm not going to maintain that we ought to be realists, to embrace the doctrine that we do perceive material objects. That question is too simple and entirely misleading. The important point is that the two terms, sense data and material things, live by taking in each other's washing. What's spurious is not one term, sense data, but the antithesis of the two. There's no one kind of thing we perceive, but very different kinds. The number being reducible, if at all, by scientific investigation and not by philosophy. So what we above all have to do is to rid ourselves of certain illusions argued by those like Berkeley, Hume, Russell, and Ayer, who have been most adept at working with the argument from illusion based on the relativity of sense data. And in that way, he goes on to defend what really amounts to a common sense realism, that in seeing sense data, what we're doing is seeing material objects anyway. He is here attacking, let's see, I guess I erased that. He's attacking a view which Ayer developed that was linguistic phenomenalism. Now, Ryle had a linguistic behaviorism. That is to say, the language of mind can be construed as the language of behaviors. Ayer had developed a linguistic phenomenalism. That is to say, the language of sense perception can be all interpreted, reduced to nothing but the language of sense data phenomena, linguistic phenomenalism. In both cases, the argument hinges on the supposed translatability of real object language, mind, matter, into some other kind of language. Its reducibility, in this case, to sense data language. And it's that which Austin argues against, contending that ordinary uses of language are totally different. They are much more subtle. They enable us to talk about both. So what you get then in this ordinary language philosophy, and I use Gilbert Ryle and Austin as further examples because they're dealt with by Stumpf. What you get, you see, is a loosening up of the whole positivist approach, a breakdown of that scientistic reductionism, a rejection of the verifiable